The motion be agreed to. Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, if Hekia Parata was actually backing the teaching profession to win and was actually focused on raising the status of the profession, then perhaps one way to start would be to give the teaching profession some degree of control over the professional body that's now going to regulate them and that they are going to be paying for. But no, that's not what this government are going to do, because this government, so confident in their views on education, so confident that they know better than the profession, are going to take complete control of the regulation of the teaching profession. They wouldn't do that to lawyers, they wouldn't do that to accountants, they wouldn't do it to doctors, they wouldn't do that to any other profession, but on teaching, the government seem to think they know better than the profession themselves. They're not going to have any democratic process for appointing the people who are going to be involved in the regulation of the teaching profession. None whatsoever. So arrogant are this government that they seem to think that they can have complete control of the teaching profession and that that's not a problem. Now, here's a parallel. A few years ago, when the Labor government, the then Labor government, were trying to regulate the real estate industry, the national government came down and filibustered until for hours and hours, complaining that the real estate agents should have the right to elect representatives to their own governing body. And here they are saying that while real estate agents should have it, while they're willing to delay progress of legislation in the House for hours and hours to give that right to real estate agents, they're not willing to give that right to every teacher in the country, and that is wrong. If this government really want to raise the status of the teaching profession through the creation of a genuinely independent professional body for the teaching profession, they could start by giving them some democratic control over who actually governs them. And that is not what this bill does. That is not what this bill does at all. In fact, it makes no reference to teachers or teaching in the name of the organisation. So this organisation, whose primary purpose is to regulate the teaching profession, to raise the status of teaching, isn't even allowed to mention teaching in its title. That shows the attitude of this government when it comes to the teaching profession. Instead of a code of ethics, an aspirational code of ethics for the teaching profession as we have now, this government are instead going to introduce a heavy-handed code of conduct. A heavy-handed code of conduct because, of course, National knows best. National knows best when it comes to teaching. In fact, I'm surprised that all those National ministers aren't actually out there in classrooms every day teaching the kids themselves, because they seem to think they know better about how kids learn than the people who are actually trained to do it and who actually devote their lives to educating the kids of this country. If this is really about raising the status of the teaching profession, why is the government seeking to deregulate parts of the teaching profession in the form of the changes that they are making to limited authorities to teach, which in fact lower the entry standards for the teaching profession? They lower the entry standards for teaching. That is what this government are doing. So much trust does this government have in the teaching profession that they want to audit 10% of all of the teacher registrations in a year. This is going to be, is this going to be like a good appraisal? No, it's a paper-based audit. It's about, have they filled in the right forms? Have the right boxes been ticked? Oh, now this is a huge number. This is going to be a huge paper-based exercise. Who's going to pay for that? Is it going to be the government? No, not one government dollar is going to go into this massive bureaucracy that is going to be required to audit teacher registrations, to do paper-based audits of teacher registrations. No, the teachers are going to have to pay for that themselves through the form of increased teacher registration fees, and yet not one additional person is going to be sitting in a classroom working out whether that teacher's actually any good. It's a paper-based review. It's a shuffling exercise. Have the right boxes been ticked? But actually, there's no guarantee that in fact the teachers are going to be any better as a result of that. It's a paper-based exercise that will result in an enormous increase in bureaucracy and won't actually increase the quality of the teaching profession. If the new Education Council of Aotearoa New Zealand are supposed to provide leadership to the teaching profession, why is it that the teaching profession aren't allowed any say in who their leaders are going to be? What is it that this government have against democracy? They certainly don't seem to think that the teaching profession should have any role in that process. Why is it that this body are going to be responsible now for the dissemination and the sharing of best practice within the teaching profession? What does the Ministry of Education do? What does the Education Review Office do? What do those thousands of people employed by the public service do if not sharing best practice? What do the colleges of education do, if not sharing best practice? What does the New Zealand Council for Educational Research do, if not sharing best practice? These are all government-funded entities, and instead they're going to transfer that responsibility to the Teaching Council, because it's not allowed to be called the Teaching Council anymore, which is paid for by the teaching profession. So basically, we now get a form of user pays professional development through the Education Council of New Zealand, where they have to pay for it themselves, as opposed to something that might be provided by, their employer, who happens to be the government. Who will pay? It will be the teaching profession that ultimately end up paying for this, and yet they have no say over how this body is made up. The government willfully ignored the vast bulk of submissions to the Select Committee, the vast bulk, or was near unanimous in the submissions to the Select Committee, basically saying that this bill was opposed almost in its entirety. Very few submissions. There might be half a dozen out of the hundreds and hundreds of submissions that we heard. 13 in favour out of hundreds and hundreds of submissions that we heard who were opposed to this bill, and yet the government says we've made a few minor technical amendments in response to public feedback. No, actually, the government largely ignored the feedback that they received from the teaching profession. Such is the high esteem in which they hold the people who are in classrooms educating kids, that they're willing to just completely ignore the feedback from the teaching profession. That is, of course, what we expect to see from the government. And of course, it wouldn't surprise me now if those who took the time to submit find themselves the victims of the vile smear machine that exists within the National Party. Because of course we know that when people put their heads above the parapet, as long as Nationals in government, they'll be absolutely smeared. And Stephen Joyce, the master of smear over there, is interjecting when we know that he has got his fingerprints all over John Key's vile smear machine that's been operating out of the beehive. In fact, it's not just on the 9th floor, it's on the 7th floor as well, because that's where Stephen Joyce's office is located, and that's where Chris Bishop used to work. He used to be part of the vile smear machine that exists within the national government, and we know that when teachers put their heads above the parapet and criticise government policy, that the big clobbering stick that this government have is going to come heading in their direction, because this is a government that don't like criticism. It's a government that don't actually want to listen to the people of New Zealand, that pay democracy lip service but don't actually believe in the fundamental principles of democracy. Because if they did, and if they were genuinely interested in raising the status of teaching in New Zealand, they would ensure that New Zealand teachers actually have a chance to have a say over the governing body. 5 out of 5 is what Hekia Parata says. Who picks the 5 out of 5? Who picks the 5 out of 9? The minister makes the entire decision about who is going to be on the governing body of the Education Council of New Zealand. That's not called democracy. That's not democracy when one person handpicks the people who are going to be responsible. That's not democracy. That is the National Party's definition of democracy, but that is not what most New Zealanders would regard as a democratic process. So heavy-handed and arrogant are this government that they seem to think that Hekia Parata hand-picking the representatives, the 9 people who are going to be on this council, that's democracy, apparently, according to Hekia Parata. And if they don't like it, they can write her a letter and suggest some people who might be on the council. Of course, you can completely ignore that, but oh gosh, they got to say they could write her a letter. But you know what? When people write Hekia Parata a letter, they get an automatic bounce back that says, I may or may not reply, and I may or may not read your email. That is what people get when they send anything to Hekia Parata, and that is her solution to democracy. If they don't like the members on the council, they can write her a letter, which she may or may not read and may or may not reply to. That's democracy, National Party style. That is how arrogant and out of touch they have got. The Labour Party will be opposing this legislation because it is heavy-handed, because it doesn't raise the status of the teaching profession, because in fact it belittles the teaching profession. It says to teachers in New Zealand that they cannot be trusted, that they need a heavy-handed national government to tell them what's good for them. It says that the National Party think they know better about what's good for educating kids than the people who are trained and who devote their lives to doing so. That is why we'll be opposing it. We'll be opposing it because it removes democratic representation from the governance bodies of tertiary councils in New Zealand. This is a bad bill, and the Labour Party will be opposing it.